From the joyous streets of Paris and the opening of the Olympic Games to the snap of gunfire at a presidential campaign rally, 2024 has seen its highs and its lows. Today's guest helps us unpack the stories that define the year and name our Story of the Year. She's Dr. Evelyn Farkas this week on Story in the Public Square. Hello and welcome to Story in the Public Square, where storytelling meets public affairs. I'm Jim Ludis from the Pell Center at Salve Regina University.
And I'm G. Wayne Miller, also with Salve's Pell Center.
And joining us this week is a dear friend. Dr. Evelyn Farkas is a former Defense Department official in the Obama administration, and she's now executive director of the McCain Institute, named for one of the great Americans, Senator John McCain. Evelyn, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Jim and Wayne. It's a pleasure.
Hey, so, you have helped us mark the end of the year and name our Story of the Year for several years now, so you're old hat at this. I went back and I was looking at some of the notes that we did to get ready for last year's episode, and a lot of the same issues still apply. Beginning with the international situation, beginning with the war in Ukraine, where you traveled recently. What's the current state of the conflict now 1,000+ days into Russia's most recent invasion?
Yeah, I mean, Jim, it feels very much like a stalemate. On the ground, you have Russian forces arrayed against Ukrainian forces. The Russians have been taking a little more territory in the east and in the south. Several months ago, in August, the Ukrainians made a daring dash into Russia and seized some territory in the Kursk region of Russia. They are holding on to that, frankly, as a bargaining chip. They've said it publicly. So you have, however, the Russian government just invited 10,000 and counting, we think, North Koreans into that area to help Russia retake the territory. But regardless, it's still more or less a stalemate. Both sides are weak. And the question is, in the long run, who can hold out if they have to hold out for the long run?
So Russian President Putin recently signed a decree updating his country's nuclear doctrine to permit the use of Russian nuclear weapons should a nuclear state support a conventional attack against Russia. How worried, Evelyn, should Americans be about this?
I mean, look, I never want to be dismissive, Wayne, about nuclear weapons and the potential use of nuclear weapons. I don't think any head of state should be threatening use of nuclear weapons the way that President Putin has. The reality, though, is that it's very unlikely that he would use nuclear weapons, and we have been supporting Ukraine as a nuclear power, as has France and the United Kingdom, also nuclear powers, supporting Ukraine all along. So I don't really know that this long-range capability striking farther into Russia that we've now allowed the Ukrainians to use changes the dynamic sufficiently. So I think Russia is being escalatory yet again.
Ev, what was the you were just in Ukraine? I think in the last month or two, right? What was
Right.
the what was
About
the
a little? Right, I came back right before our elections
Okay.
on November 5th.
what was the sentiment? What was the spirit like among the Ukrainians that you talked to?
Yeah, I mean, Jim, they're tired. So, first of all, they've had a president in power now for 5 years. I think the people are ready for a change. They would love for the war to be over, but they recognize that the threat to them is existential. I mean, they're fighting for the right to have their state not to be conquered by Russia and governed by the Kremlin, and governed by an autocracy, essentially with a corrupt economic system. They want to be part of NATO. They want to have security guarantees so they can maintain their sovereignty, and they'd like to join the European Union. So the people are tired, but they're hanging in there. They do have a manpower problem, more so than an equipment problem. We're providing them with equipment. However, the Russians also have their constraints on manpower.
So what about the war in the Middle East? It's been a year now, over a year. The conflict has gone from Gaza to southern Lebanon. What's your assessment of that conflict now, more than a year after it began?
The situation in the Middle East, frankly, worries me more so than the situation in Europe, so between Russia and Ukraine, because President Netanyahu, I mean, Prime Minister Netanyahu, rather, he's determined to achieve his objectives, use of military force, to essentially take out as many Hamas fighters as he can, which comes at a great cost, which he seems to not take into adequate consideration. He does seem like he wants to make peace in the north with Hezbollah. He's weakened them tremendously, and that is likely to happen, and it will be a gift that probably he will give to the incoming President Trump. But I'm worried about what's happening in the West Bank, because there, the settler movement is quite violent. They're moving Palestinians out, and that is a tinderbox. And this is another area where Prime Minister Netanyahu is not constrained by the United States government anymore, and I think it could lead to greater conflict and ongoing conflict in Israel.
Yeah, Ev, one of the dynamics we've seen in 2024 have been open, direct military exchanges, missile salvos, airstrikes between Iran and Israel, both strike and counterstrike. This seems to portend sort of it's a harbinger of a regional conflict. What do you think the dynamic is there in the region? How likely is it that you think 2025 might see that conflict spread?
Yeah, I mean, I think next year your story might be, Jim, in the Middle East, because right now the Iran broke the taboo and directly struck at Israel rather than striking through Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis in Yemen, which they also have been doing. They struck directly at Israel. Israel struck back, and then Iran struck back. The Israeli response, I think, they've been tempered so far. But I predict that when President Trump comes into office, it's likely that he continues his handoff policy vis-a-vis Israel, and he may even agree to help Israel bomb Iranian nuclear facilities, which you can argue might actually end up leading to a better position in terms of U.S. and Israeli and global pressure on Iran to abandon its nuclear weapons program and, frankly, abandon also its support for terrorist groups.
So this year also saw a worsening of the climate crisis, with records sent around the globe for heat, catastrophic flooding, and so forth and so on. What does that portend, and what can the global community do about that? A big question, I realize, but what are your thoughts?
Well, Wayne, this is the story that hasn't received as much attention, certainly here in the United States in the context of our presidential campaign. We didn't hear that much about climate change. And then we just had the most recent UN climate conference in Azerbaijan, which is actually a big fuel producing, fossil fuel producing nation. And apparently it wasn't a resounding success in terms of commitments. I'm very worried about this. Just as a frequent flyer, the reality is climate change is being felt in the aircraft. There's a new level of turbulence, literally. I often talk about political turbulence, but if you're in an airplane, you're also feeling physical turbulence. And right now, the industry doesn't really know how to predict when the turbulence is going to reach a point where it's actually incredibly dangerous and people have lost lives with this new turbulence. So climate change, but leaving that aside for a second, there are the floods, the fires. I mean, it's never ending. We know that we need another appropriation coming out of Congress because of these natural disasters. In the case of the U.S., mostly because of the hurricanes. But all of these natural disasters are increasing in frequency, so there's many more of them, and they're increasing in terms of the damage they're producing. That will have an impact around the globe. It means more refugee flows, and of course our international system is under incredible stress. We haven't been handling the mass migration of humans for the last decade very well at all, to say the least.
And it also affects production of food, both in this country and abroad. Talk a little bit briefly about that. We've had a guest on recently who get into that in some depth, and that's another crisis: food, feeding.
Right. Well, of course, we have warfare that affects it, but we also have climate change. There's a recent New York Times report about sites in Central Asia where they were doing uranium mining. Uranium, of course, used in nuclear processing. And the uranium mines were closed, and they built some dams around them so that the material that was left there would not leak into groundwater. Well, apparently, probably because of climate change, changing water levels, there's been seepage. That has the potential to wipe out real disaster in the Ferragamo Valley in Central Asia, which is a huge breadbasket for not just the region, but the world. So that's just one little story. But Wayne, yes, I mean, if you have drought and flooding, that impacts where you can grow certain crops. And of course, the human toll will be quite large if you can't predict it.
You know, the 10,000 years of human history is based on a certain Goldilocks moment in climate history. We seem to be upending that. 2024 saw one of the more joyous moments in the Paris Olympics. You know, and so instead of just sort of dwelling on all the doom and gloom of the last year, we wanted to take a moment to just sort of really think about what the Olympics continues to mean even now in the 21st century.
Well, Jim, I would say at a time when we're suffering from climate change, when we democracies are fighting against autocracy for human rights for all people all over the world, the Olympics provide hope. And I think hope is the fundamental ingredient. Václav Havel, the great Czech dissident democratic leader in the Czech Republic, who then became president after the wall fell of the Czech Republic, of Czechoslovakia at the time, he always talked about the need for hope. People need hope, and the Olympics give us hope that we can do something about war, do something about climate change, that we can recognize the human potential to do good and to achieve.
Well, so, you know, and maybe another element of the good news story this year, more than 100 nations went to the polls. More than half of the planet's population participated in democratic elections, which is a remarkable achievement in and of itself in human history. You're a student of elections and democracy. How significant is that kind of global participation in democracy in 2024?
That's another reason for hope. People feel that their voice counts, that their vote counts. And so they're going out to express that desire to have a say, to participate. And I think, of course, when you are looking at a democracy, the basic element of a democracy is the right to vote. There are many more things that go into a democracy, as we know: participating, creating civic organizations, having a media, participating in the media. All of that is really important. Running for office yourself is important. But the fundamental, it all starts with the fundamental step, which is the vote.
So all of these elections took place in all of these countries. What is the state of global democracy now? If you can give a general overview and not get into, obviously, each of the 100 plus.
Yeah, I don't have the latest Freedom House report at my fingertips, but I would suggest to your audience that they go and look it up. Unfortunately, democracy worldwide has been on the run, if you will. It's been under assault from the autocrats. So despite all of the voting going on, there's been pressure on countries, autocratic pressure, populist pressures across the globe. So democracy is not on the ascendant. I think the high point probably in recent history was, you know, when the Berlin Wall fell and we saw the former Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact states switch to democracy, and we saw similar changes in Latin America. We're seeing, unfortunately, a bit of a pushback, a retrenchment. Some of it has to do, frankly, Wayne, with the economic changes, the climate changes, technological changes. People are just uneasy, and they look for a strong leader, and these strong leaders often do not tend to be Democrats. They tend to be more autocratic and populist in nature.
Yeah, Evelyn, you and I both came of age at a time when there was this optimism springing from the collapse of the old Iron Curtain, the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, when we thought that, and people like Francis Fukuyama argued that the end of history had arrived because democracy was ascendant. looking back on those moments now, looking back on that interpretation of events 30 plus years ago now, does it seem naive in retrospect? Is the competition between democracy and autocracy just going to always be with us?
Yes, Jim, because I think it's human nature. I mean, at the end of the day, democracy is like any relationship that you have, whether it's a marriage or a friendship. It requires hard work and cultivation. And you cannot just take your democracy, like your friendships and your relationships, for granted. You have to work on it. You have to work on maintaining a vibrant democracy. Otherwise, all of the bad elements of society could come up, rear their head again: fear, anger, polarization, all of these things that are hallmarks of populism, but also of autocracy. Those other trends can come to the fore and put pressure on your democracy in a way that it finds it hard to withstand them. So again, it's just like a relationship dynamic. You have positive and negative forces competing against one another. I believe it's human nature, so we have to continue the fight. But there are ways to be stronger as democracies, things like programs like yours, where you dive deep and you put some transparency and educate people.
Well, that's a great segue for us, and it brings us to our story of the year. Of course, among the nations that went to the polls in 2024, the United States of America chose a new president, a new House of Representatives, and a substantial portion of the U.S. Senate. The election itself was marred by concerns over potential violence in the aftermath of the vote, as well as actual violence on the campaign trail, where former President Donald Trump survived 2 assassination attempts. The Democratic Party was roiled with uncertainty after a halting debate performance in June by President Joe Biden, but seemed to pivot smoothly to support Vice President Kamala Harris in July. Throughout the shortest presidential race between 2 candidates in any of our lifetimes, opinion polls showed a race that was neck and neck throughout the fall. But ultimately, the results surprised many Americans with a distinctive rightward shift in American politics in every state and virtually every congressional district, even those that still voted for Democrats. And so our 2024 story of the year is the return of President Donald Trump to power and the apparent shift to the right in American politics. Evelyn, you've been around politics for a long time and you've been a candidate yourself. What do you see in these election results?
I think, Jim, that the way you characterized it is correct. It's a shift to the right, but it's also a shift to fundamentals. Interestingly, James Carville, who was the advisor to President Clinton, he talked about it's the economy, stupid. And this time around, he didn't focus on that, and he actually said that Kamala Harris would win, that Vice President Harris would win. And I think what we ended up finding out was that people were mostly focused on their pocketbooks, mostly focused on the economy. Now, there were other people who voted for other reasons, some of them having to do with race, with misogyny, not wanting to have a woman in power, whether it was something that it was overt or, frankly, not recognized even by themselves, perhaps. But by and large, I think most people voted for change. And that was the other thing that I think was tricky for the vice president. She was not seen as sufficiently differentiated from President Biden. And of course, that largely came from the fact that she didn't have much time to differentiate herself, although she also didn't make any bold statements to do so.
So, Evelyn, you mentioned economics, and I think clearly you're right. That was a huge factor in the election of Donald Trump. Can you break that down a little bit in terms of, the household, the individual pocketbook, in terms of prices for food, in terms of housing, and all of those costs? Those have all gone up in the last 4 years. And can you give us a little detail on that? I think that's a question a lot of people would like to have you answer.
Yeah, I mean, Wayne, so what was a little bit perplexing, I think, from the perspective certainly of the Democrats and President Biden probably, was the fact that the economy actually hasn't been this strong. If you pull up The Economist magazine, which is a neutral magazine, it's a kind of center-right British magazine, they said America's economy is kind of the envy of the world. We had, and we have, managed to, come through the pandemic and build our economy, continue manufacturing, continue providing services, and we even managed to tackle inflation, which was a problem. And so if you look at just the statistics, the U.S. economy looks like it's doing well. The rate of unemployment is low. All of those factors that economists look at. However, the fact that the Biden administration put different infusions of money, they had the COVID infusion and then they put in the Inflation Reduction Act, those amounts of money did create an upward pressure on prices, not all of which are actually measured by the inflation metrics. So, for example, fuel and food are not measured, but fuel and food were exactly those things that people felt were too expensive for them in their everyday lives. So when someone like Donald Trump said to them, do you feel better off today than you did, before Biden came into office, perhaps, or last year? They would say, no, because I'm struggling to pay for eggs and simple commodities like that.
It's a universal formula that has worked again and again. Hey, Ev, you've worked in the United States Senate. President-elect Trump has said that he may seek to circumvent the Senate's constitutional role to provide advice and consent on the confirmation of cabinet officers. What's your take to that approach by this president?
Well, I hope he doesn't succeed. It's really important. And this is a bipartisan principle. It's enshrined in our Constitution. It protects the rights of the minority, and it also makes sure that the president doesn't act like a king, that the president selects people to run the major bureaus of our government, the major components of our government, who are qualified and who have the ethics that are required. In the case of the Defense Department, you have almost 3 million people that the Secretary of Defense is responsible for, active duty and reserve military personnel as well as civilians scattered all over the globe. That person needs to have proper experience, proper judgment, and of course, good ethics. So that's just one example. The intelligence community also, of course, and our internal agencies. You need to make sure you have the right people at the helm, and the Senate provides that check on the president.
So Americans chose to return a former president convicted of 34 felonies while under indictment for dozens more. What does that say about the health of American democracy?
Well, it makes me really sad, frankly, Wayne. We should be able to find another candidate, another politician who has not been convicted of felonies to run our country. And frankly, that's a failure on the part of the Republican Party, I would argue, because you should try to find, again, non-criminal candidates. But it is what it is. Donald Trump very deftly took control of the party. He is now the duly elected president. And so we'll have to see what impact it has culturally. And in terms of an example to set to young people, it's not encouraging, but we'll see how the Senate and the rest of the body politic responds. Hopefully, again, the Senate will have a role to play because they do have access to information and intelligence, sensitive information that they can use to provide advice and consent to the president and his cabinet.
Hey, Evelyn, we've got just a few minutes left here. I've got sort of a two-part question for you. The first is, what do you say to those Americans who are despairing of the political direction of the country? And the second question is, what do you say to those Americans who are rejoicing?
Well, to those who are despairing, I say, look, there are congressional elections again in 2 years. There are local elections happening all the time because people retire or they pass away or what have you. There are all kinds of opportunities to get involved. So don't give up. Don't despair. Don't doom scroll and don't sit there, thinking about the worst case scenario. Just get out there and participate. Be a kind person. Try to work across political lines as much as possible. For the people who are rejoicing, I would say, humility is always an important component of political life and of life in general. And so if you're on the winning end, try to have grace and try to also understand those who are afraid, perhaps, because maybe they're coming from Muslim communities or they're coming from other immigrant communities that are afraid that they might be deported even if they're here legally. So I think there are many reasons why people should think about the other side, whether they're on the winning side politically or the losing side, and show grace and kindness.
I don't know if this is a question that you can answer, but is this, as a candidate, as a president, as a candidate, again, Donald Trump has broken a lot of norms in American politics. Do you think that norm breaking is going to be unique to him, or do you think that that's something that's going to last long beyond another Trump presidency?
I don't see other politicians really following his lead. I don't see other politicians using Twitter, for example, or Truth Social the way that he uses it. So I find it hard to imagine that anyone else would be as disruptive as he is. And it takes a certain charisma that admittedly he has, a certain kind of also shamelessness. And I think that's a trait of a populist leader. But populist leaders that are effective don't come across the screen every day. So I'm not terribly worried that someone might try to emulate him and succeed. I do hope we go back to the norms, and I think fundamentally Americans are kind of small c conservative, and they would prefer to have their leaders polite with one another. They voted for President Trump largely because they wanted change from what they had been experiencing the last 4 years. That doesn't mean that they want change across the board in terms of how we treat one another. It remains to be seen what they really wanted. President Trump will start enacting his agenda. And again, in 2 years, there'll be congressional elections. That's one way to see whether he's achieving his objectives or whether people are happy with him or not.
Dr. Evelyn Farkas, thank you so much for spending some time with us. She's at the McCain Institute. That is all the time we have this week, but if you want to know more about Story in the Public Square, you can find us on social media or visit pellcenter.org, where you can always catch up on previous episodes. He's Wayne, I'm Jim, asking you to join us again next time for more Story in the Public Square.